So you have, over the course of the last 6-8 years, a series of Supreme Court decisions that systematically dismantle protections against money in politics. And you write in this great piece you did for Medium about the way in which you, a constitutional law professor, you clerked for the Supreme Court, actually misunderstood the effect. That you thought this would be corporations rushing in. But actually, it's politicians who need to buy insurance. It's not about the money that gets spent, but about the money that could be spent.
Right. This was a point that Evan Bayh articulated in an exchange that I saw him have with Senator Specter, where he was describing the dynamic that super PACs create. And he said, the thing that I'm most fearful of, that any incumbent is most fearful of, is that 30 days before the election, some super PAC will come in and drop $1 million against you. So you need to prepare for that. And the way you prepare for that is, these weren't his words, but this is the way to understand it, you buy super PAC insurance. And what that means is you affiliate with somebody on your side who would be willing to drop $1 million to defend you against the $1 million that was spent against you. Mm-hmm. Well, how do you buy insurance like this? Well, like any insurance policy, you got to pay the premium in advance. And how do you pay the premium in advance here? You basically signal that you're the kind of person that this super PAC would want to support. So they might have standards. They might say we can only support people who get a 90% voting score on our voting card. So now you have a target to aim for, 90%. And this becomes the economics of a protection racket. This is the sort of thing that Tony Soprano would have understood, because now you have people behaving in a way that assures the kind of protection they need, and not a single dollar has changed hands. The super PAC has achieved exactly its objective. And that dynamic, I think, nobody was expecting, nobody was planning or thinking about when they unleashed the series of decisions that created the super PAC.
I think the way that most of us understand or conceptualize this kind of interaction, it's that the rich guy or the lobbyist or the head of the super PAC goes to the politician and says that you're going to vote my way or I'm going to drop $1 million on you and for your opponent. I spoke a while back to some folks who were involved in passing the McCain-Feingold. One thing they said, which is interesting, was that they had a lot of support from rich folks because rich guys were tired of being hit up by politicians. Yeah. And the politicians often do it almost in reverse. That, well, if they don't get the donation, who knows how they'll vote?
And that dynamic is shot through that system. My favorite example is the doc fix, right? So the Medicare Act has this provision where they're supposed to reduce the reimbursement rate for doctors every year. And every year the question comes up whether they will reduce the reimbursement rate. And every year they vote not to reduce the reimbursement rate. But before they vote that way, of course, there are lots of efforts out to doctors saying we need to build the support to stop the doc fix, right? So this becomes a money printing machine for congressmen because of the threat of how it's going to affect the interests of doctors. Same thing with, Al Gore. I tell the story in my book. Al Gore, when he was vice president, had this idea for deregulating a significant chunk of the telecommunications industry. His chief lobbyist takes it to Capitol Hill, and as he reports it back to me, the response from Capitol Hill was, hell no, if we deregulate these guys, how are we going to raise money from them, right? So the point is, you have your hands in as much as you possibly can, so you have as many chains as you can possibly pull when you need to raise money from people to fund your elections. And this is why I say, to people on the right all the time, you can say that the solution to all of this is smaller government. But how are you going to get smaller government when the way we fund elections gives congressmen an interest in larger, more invasive government? You've got a thumb on the scale against your objective of shrinking the size of government, because if you shrink the size of government, they can't fund their campaigns anymore.
You're running something called the May Day PAC, and you raised $1 million that'll be matched in May, and you're trying to raise $5 million that'll be matched with another $5 million in June. And if you do that, you'll have $12 million to spend on the 2014 election, kind of as a first step. How can you fight money in politics by raising an enormous amount of money in order to win elections?
Well, the only way we solve the problem of money in politics is changing the rules, changing the rules of how campaigns get funded. Now, to change the rules, we need a Congress. To get a Congress, we have to have a super PAC capable of exerting enough coordinating influence to achieve that, and so that's the strategy. Because in my view, the critical problem is not that corporations can speak or that money is speech or that there's lots of money spent on negative ads. The critical problem is we've outsourced the funding of campaigns to the tiniest fraction of the 1%. And we can change that by electing a Congress that's committed to a system of small dollar funded elections, whether it's the Republican version of that, which would be vouchers, or the Democratic version of that, which would be matching funds. Either way, you change the rules, and you can radically change the way campaigns get funded.
Let's just back up on the mechanics here for a second.
So I favor what a lot of conservatives talk about as the solution, even though that's not my politics, but I favor a voucher system. And a voucher system basically says every voter gets a voucher. In my book, I talked about every voter getting a $50 voucher. Mm-hmm. And they can give that voucher to any candidate who agrees to fund his or her campaign with vouchers and maybe small contributions on top.
What are the unintended consequences you worry about in a system like that?
Well, there's a lot of right-thinking reformers, people who, whose views I respect because they've been in this fight forever, people like Fred Wertheimer, who I think are genuinely concerned that if we shift too much power to people to kind of create these coalitions and groups through this kind of small dollar funding, they'll be driving for their own kind of special interest legislation. That we'll get more special interest legislation than we have right now. It'll just be driven by coalitions of voters, AARP or NRA, instead of by K Street lobbyists.
You donate to the NRA slate,
yeah,
would be the word.
Yeah, you allocate your voucher the way NRA says you should allocate it, or the AARP, or Planned Parenthood, whatever. And so this is aggregating at a much lower level. It's bundling at the $50 level. And you might think, well, the policies that come out of that are just not good policies. And my response to that is, right, democracy isn't a guarantee of good government. Mm-hmm. And there's going to be many things that a democracy does that I disagree with. Of course, I'm an elite member of a Harvard faculty. Of course, I'm going to disagree with it. But I don't see the alternative to empowering a responsive democracy, at least in the current political context. We're not going to pick 12 law professors to decide how we should make policy in the United States. We're not going to turn more over to the courts. People don't trust the courts. So in some sense, we've got to revitalize democracy and then engage in the hard fight to convince people at the democratic level what they ought to do.
When I read the political science on this stuff, I think that what you end up having are highly polarized, highly ideological, highly involved people. And then folks who, and this is in many ways the most salient polarization in American politics, who just don't care all that much. And there's really interesting research, some by a guy named David Brookman over at Berkeley, that folks who just don't care that much, if I'm recalling this paper right, it isn't so much that they are moderate, although they often appear so in polls. It's that when you poll them, they have extreme views in all kinds of different directions. They're not coherently organized by an ideology the way a hardcore conservative is or the way a hardcore liberal is. They have views that are somewhat vaguer. And you can, I think, kind of imagine that falling any sort of way. It might fall that what they want is a more inspiring politics, a politics they can trust. They might want a politics where people work together. Or it might turn out that when you have to cut through to people who are listening with a volume turned down so low, that you actually have to scream much louder. I don't know, this is all very speculative, but I think it's an interesting question that would have to be.
Yeah, this actually is completely consistent with great work that's been done to demonstrate the polarized Americans are the politically active Americans, and the non-politically active are not polarized. Maybe it's because they're mixed in this way, but maybe they're just more moderate in their view. But then again, if you think about the business model of funding a campaign, when you do it at $50 pops, you create an incredible incentive for politicians to figure out how to get those people engaged. Now, in that system, $50 a voter is about $7 billion, which is about 3 times the total amount raised and spent in the last congressional election. So it's real money. But the point is to raise that money you're not talking to the tiniest fraction of the 1%, you're talking to the wide range of potential people who could be supporting you. So it spreads out the funder influence. And in doing that, it removes what I think is the core corrosive dynamic of the current way in which we fund elections, which is to create this incredible incentive to bend government and policy to make this tiny, tiny number of people happy so that they fund your campaign.